the young people watching the African Teen Summit across the African continent this afternoon. My name is Zulaikha Patel, and I am a social justice and anti-racism activist. I'm an author and a speaker. And my address is going to be centered around why it's so important for us to tell our stories as the African youth. And one of the biggest things that comes to my mind whenever I think storytelling is, I think, rewriting the narrative. And why it's so important for us to rewrite the narrative is, for far too long, our narrative has been in the hands of others and not in our own hands, and we've never been able to tell our own history and tell our own history about our roots, what we're rooted in, and who we are, and what our cultures are rooted in. And rewriting the narrative ultimately would be us being at the forefront of telling our own history and writing our own history, and being at the center of telling stories about us for the world. And that's so important because it then shapes our truth, and we're able to tell our untold history, which has not been told, and parts of our history which has been erased or watered down. And telling our history is so important because it's so important for our stories to not die down, and for our stories to not get watered down, and for our stories to be preserved for legacies and for centuries to come. And us being voices in storytelling ultimately will enable us as young people to become voices for our communities, voices about our communities, and voices ultimately about our own African agenda, and what that agenda is, and why that agenda is so important, you know. And one of the biggest things as well about storytelling is storytelling preserves culture. And we live in a world today where it's so important to preserve culture, so that for centuries to come, generations are able to learn from that, and are able to see who we are and what we represent. And representation is such an important and integral thing. It's so important for us to see ourselves reflected in the world that we live in today, to see ourselves and see our faces and see our stories, and see our stories being portrayed in the world that we live in different facets of the world that we live in. It's important for us to see our stories in the pages of literature. It's important for us to see our faces on television screens. And it's important for us to ultimately see our culture in the world that we live in today. And representation is important because when you see yourself, you're empowered. You're empowered because you are affirmed. Your being is being affirmed, and you see the importance of who you are. And so representation is very, very integral, and is something that comes from storytelling. And that's why storytelling is so important, and is something that is going to advance us as the youth forward, and advance us in our advocacy as the youth forward, and also advance us in representation and seeing ourselves more in the world that we live in, and using our voices to bring forth representation, and us ultimately becoming active voices in our communities, helps us then create a platform for our community to come forward and tell their own stories, and talk about our challenges and how we can solve those, and find solutions to our problems, and ultimately find African solutions to African problems. And I believe that us as young people should be at the forefront of telling our own stories, because as young people, we are the ones that are going to inherit our future, and we are the ones that are going to occupy the future. And so it is so integral for us to be at the forefront of shaping and defining the future that we are going to inherit and occupy. And we can do that through storytelling. And I believe that storytelling is us speaking for those who are not able to speak for themselves, and us emancipating our ancestors who are not able to tell their stories.